Hi there, I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes. And if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. Let my voice and the sound of rain carry you gently into sleep. Now then, let's begin. The tower had no name. It didn't need one. For 12 long years, it had belonged to her. Isabel, Queen of Lysmere, had never walked through a market. She had never ridden a horse, never touched the earth with bare feet or smelled the sea. All she knew were stone walls, iron bolts, and the hushed voices of servants who weren't allowed to speak her name. From the moment she was crowned at 5 years old, her small hands barely able to hold the scepter her fate had been sealed. Not as a ruler, not as a child of destiny, but as a symbol, a puppet, a reminder to a conquered people that their freedom had been traded for silence. Outside the tower, the kingdom moved on. The flags of Verdant flew high on the palace walls. The king's advisors sat in her father's throne room, issuing decrees in a language she hadn't been allowed to learn. But inside the tower, time stood still. There were no clocks, no calendars, only the rhythm of the guards' boots, the scrape of plates on stone, the changing of her dresses, lighter in summer, heavier in winter. And then there was him. Darian. He had been there since the beginning. A soldier of the conquering army promoted to royal protector, though everyone knew what he really was, her keeper, her shadow, her cage with a human face. He was never cruel, not with words at least. He spoke to her rarely, and when he did, his tone was clipped, rehearsed like someone reading from a script he no longer believed in. But he watched her constantly, at meals, during her lessons. Even when she slept, she could feel his presence just beyond the door. As the years passed, she stopped wondering why he was always there. She stopped asking questions altogether. The only voice she heard regularly was her tutor's, a soft-spoken woman named Eleanor, who had once served her mother. Eleanor taught her letters, numbers, and history, though never the true kind. She told stories of kings and queens, of honor and law, but left out the parts about betrayal and war. Still, Isabel listened. She memorized every word, not because she believed in them, but because she was building something, quietly, patiently, inside herself, a fortress. She read everything she could find, memorized court customs, studied the maps Eleanor smuggled to her in books. She knew every line of the old Lysmerian laws, knew which noble families still existed, knew who had bent the knee and who had simply vanished. And she waited. Years passed. Her hair grew long, dark like her mother's. Her eyes changed too, once wide with fear, now sharp with calculation. And her silence, once born of terror, became something else entirely, a weapon. By the time she turned 14, there was nothing left of the child who had screamed when they took her father. In her place stood something quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. But danger only matters when it's seen. And to the Council of Verdant, Isabel was just a girl in a dress, a relic of a fallen line, a final problem to solve. And so they sent a message, not to her, but to Darian. In 5 days' time, he would marry her. The letter came folded in black wax, stamped with the sigil of the council, 2 crossed swords over a broken crown. Darian received it with his usual silence, his jaw tightening only slightly as he read the contents. He didn't speak to her that day, nor the next. But on the 3rd morning, he entered her chamber just after dawn, uninvited. "I've been ordered to marry you," he said simply. She didn't answer. She was sitting by the window, watching frost creep over the stone sill. The silence stretched. "The ceremony is to be held in the old chapel," he added, almost as an afterthought. 5 days from now. Still, she didn't speak. She turned her head, just slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. What passed between them wasn't recognition. It was something older, colder. A mutual understanding forged not by love, but by long years of captivity. "I see," she said at last. No outrage, no fear. Just 2 words spoken with such quiet finality that Darian blinked. For the first time in his life, he looked at her not as a prisoner, not even as a ward, but as a stranger. Someone unreadable. Someone dangerous. He left without another word. The preparations were minimal. There would be no music, no guests, no feasting or flower petals or prayers. The council had made it clear this was not a celebration. It was a seal. A way to erase her name from the scrolls of succession. A way to turn a queen into a wife, and a wife into nothing. Eleanor cried when she brushed Isabel's hair the night before the ceremony. Her hands trembled as she fastened the simple ivory gown around her waist. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. But Isabel only looked at her through the mirror, calm and still. "I was born doing this." When the chapel doors creaked open the next morning, the sky was heavy with ash-colored clouds. The wind howled through the broken, stained glass. Isabel walked alone, without escort, without music, her bare feet echoing against the stone floor. Darian stood at the altar, armored as always, a sword at his hip. He did not reach for her hand when she approached. The priest, a gaunt man, loyal to Verdanth, spoke the vows without emotion, like a man reading a list of debts. "Do you, Darian of House Veller, accept this union, sworn by decree of the ruling council? I do. Do you, Isabel of Lysmere, relinquish claim to crown and title, and accept the bond of wife in the name of peace?" There was a pause, long enough for the wind to make its voice heard. "I do." And just like that, it was done. She was no longer queen. She was wife to a man she had never chosen. Bound not by love, but by politics. Caged again, only this time, the bars wore rings of gold. They did not speak that night. They did not share a bed. Darian returned to his old quarters by the barracks. Isabel remained in the tower alone, her white gown folded neatly at the foot of her bed. But something had changed. For years, Isabel had been the passive piece on someone else's game board. But now she was on the move. Marriage had stripped her of her title, yes, but it had also given her something far more valuable access. As a royal wife, she could now leave the tower, attend council meetings, dine in the great hall, speak to nobles' guard servants. She could listen. She could gather. She could build. The morning after the wedding, she walked through the castle gates for the first time in a decade. Heads turned. Some bowed, others whispered. She felt the tension ripple like a crack beneath glass. She was no longer the ghost in the tower. She was flesh, present, watching. Her first stop was the old library. Many of the old records had been burned when Lysmere fell, but not all. Buried beneath dust and shadow, she found documents the new regime had forgotten: land grants, oaths of loyalty, bloodline charts. She studied them obsessively, her memory sharper than any blade. At council dinners, she watched the members closely, learned who drank too much, who lied with their eyes, who carried secrets like hidden knives. Darian sat beside her, silent, guarded, but she could feel his unease. He had expected a broken girl. What he got was a strategist. And then came the letters. She began writing them at night by candlelight in ink, so fine it vanished underwater. Letters to old families, to distant lords who had not bent the knee, to mountain tribes who still whispered the name Lysmere with reverence. She signed them not as Queen Isabel, not as Lady Veller, but simply, "I remain." One night Darian found her awake by the hearth, her fingers ink-stained, her expression unreadable. "You're planning something," he said. Not a question. She looked up at him, her face lit only by the flicker of flame. "I was born planning something," she replied. He didn't ask again. Weeks passed. The castle grew restless. Rumors bloomed in hallways like mold. Some said the queen had gone mad. Others said she was pregnant with a prophecy. Some guards began switching shifts. Noblemen suddenly left town without notice. And through it all, Isabel moved like smoke. Quiet. Inescapable. She no longer wore white. She wore the old Lysmerian blue, deep as dusk, trimmed in silver. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. At meals, her gaze held power again. She asked questions no one dared answer. She spoke in tones that made councilmen drop their spoons. The tower had not broken her. The wedding had not erased her. She was not finished. And in the deepest corner of the castle, beneath the flagstones of the old chapel, a fire began to burn. Not a metaphor. A real fire. A secret forge. And above it, a name was etched into iron. Isabel. The forge beneath the chapel had once been used to melt down heirlooms, rings, goblets, scepters, all bearing the sigil of Lysmere. It was there that the conquerors had burned the kingdom's past into slag. But now its fire served another purpose. Isabel visited it under the cover of night, her face hooded, her steps silent. The old blacksmith, a half-blind man named Rurik, had once sworn an oath to her father. He had stayed after the fall, pretending to forget the weight of those words. But when Isabel came to him and whispered, "Do you remember who you served?" he had simply nodded, tears shining in his cataract-clouded eyes. Under her orders, he crafted not weapons, but symbols. Seals, medallions, small pieces of blue steel engraved with a phoenix. The old sigil of Lysmere, long banned under threat of death. Isabel began handing them out in secret, slipped into the palms of servant soldiers, stable boys. Most cried when they held it. Some kissed it. All kept them hidden close to the heart. She never asked for loyalty. She reminded them of it. While the council debated grain taxes and border treaties in the high chambers, Isabel worked in the cracks. She spoke with kitchen maids whose brothers had died in the war. She listened to orphaned pages recite the old hymns in a whisper. She met with Darian's subordinates, men who had once been foot soldiers and had not forgotten the day Lysmere burned. The tide, slow and silent, began to shift. And Darian watched. He was not blind. He knew she was building something. But the truth gnawed at him like rot. He no longer knew which side he was on. Darian had spent half his life carrying out the will of the council. He'd raided villages, enforced decrees, stood guard at executions. He'd once believed it was for peace, for order. But living beside Isabel, watching her resurrect a nation with nothing but whispers and memory, he began to feel the weight of his uniform like a shackle. One night, he followed her. She moved like someone born in shadows, weaving through the castle's forgotten passages. He trailed her down into the crypts past the sleeping quarters of the dead. And there, beneath the old altar, he saw it, a gathering. Not an army yet. Just a handful of figures cloaked and quiet. But their faces were familiar. A scribe, a soldier, a seamstress. All had something in common. They had lost someone to the war, and they had found something to believe in again. Isabel stood at the center, her voice low but unshakable. "We were taught to bow," she said. "We were told our history was a crime. That silence would save us. But silence is not peace. Peace built on fear is just another name for prison." Someone knelt. Then another. Then another. Darian didn't step forward. He left before anyone could see him. But that night, he took off his council badge and placed it in the fire. From that moment, things accelerated. Small acts of rebellion flared across the city. A banner bearing the phoenix appeared briefly on the watchtower before being torn down. Coins with the old queen's face began circulating in the market. A councilman's favorite stallion vanished later, found stabled safely in the forest with a note tied to its mane. For Lysmere. The council grew nervous. They summoned Isabel to chambers more often, their questions sharp, their tones clipped. But she remained polite, composed, regal even. They could not punish her, she was their peace bride after all, their symbol of mercy. But symbols can become flames if left unchecked. And so they turned to the one man who had always obeyed Darian. They asked him to spy, to report, to control her. He said nothing, and that silence was their answer. The next morning, Darian was removed from his post and reassigned to a northern outpost. Isabel was given a new guard, a young brute named Kale, chosen not for loyalty, but for obedience. The council thought her alone again. They were wrong. By then, Isabel's network had stretched like ivy through the castle. Even in isolation, her words traveled faster than feet. When she learned of Darian's exile, she did not cry. She did not plead. She simply wrote him a letter. "They've removed you because you hesitated. That means you've already chosen." Darian read it by firelight in the cold north, the wind screaming outside his tent. And with that, he made his decision. He disappeared. The council sent scouts. They found nothing. No body, no tracks. Only an empty uniform and a broken chain bearing the crest of Verdant. Darian Velor had ceased to exist, or so they thought. Back in the capital, Isabel played her part to perfection. She attended court functions. She smiled when spoken to. She walked the garden paths under watchful eyes. But inside, she was already preparing for the next move. Then came the funeral. Councillor Marin, the eldest and most feared of the lords, died in his sleep. Natural causes, they claimed. But whispers spread quickly. Poison, retaliation, ghosts. His death sent shockwaves through the hierarchy. And when Isabel offered to speak at his burial, the council reluctantly allowed it out of tradition, perhaps, or fear of seeming cruel. She wore black silk, trimmed in Lysmerian blue. Her hair was unbound, flowing down her shoulders like the rivers on the old maps. She stepped onto the chapel dais and looked out at the gathered nobles' guards and curious citizens. My Lord Marin once told me she began that Lysmere had to die so that the future could live. A pause. I think he was right. Another pause. The air grew still. But he was wrong in thinking that Lysmere is dead. She let that hang in the air. Then she stepped down. No more words. No more explanations. Just presence. Just defiance. The council convened in secret that night. 2 argued for arrest. 1 demanded exile. But none could agree. To punish her openly would risk martyrdom. To ignore her risked revolution. So they did nothing. And that was their final mistake. Because in the days that followed, the city began to change. Banners were painted then hidden. Swords were sharpened in cellars. Secret pacts were made in taverns once loyal to the conquerors. And in the quiet heart of it all stood Isabel, widowed of power, cloaked in memory, burning with a fury older than thrones. She no longer dreamed of escape. She dreamed of justice. The days after the funeral stretched long and tense, like the pause before a storm. The castle's walls seemed to listen more carefully, echoing each whispered rumor, each hurried step. Something was happening. Everyone felt it, but no one dared to name it. Isabel kept her silence. That was her weapon now. Not steel, not spells, but stillness. Because silence, when held with confidence, is louder than any scream. She moved through the castle like a ghost given form, graceful calm, unknowable. The new guard, Kyle, followed her closely, but she learned quickly how to use him. He was young, ambitious, and untested. A man like him didn't fear danger, he feared irrelevance. She fed him carefully crafted questions, sowed doubt in his mind, made him believe that watching her wasn't a punishment, but a promotion. And so he became her shadow, yes, but not the kind that sees. The kind that protects without knowing why. Meanwhile, outside the stone walls, the city of Lysmere was waking from a long sleep. In the bakeries, loaves shaped like phoenixes began appearing subtle, beautiful, and forbidden. Street musicians played the old songs at dusk, the ones outlawed by the council. And in the black of night, children chalked forgotten names on alley walls. Isabel lives. The council responded with fear, disguised as order. New laws, more guards, curfews. But fear, when spread too thin, loses its edge. In the poorest quarter of the city, a cart carrying grain was overturned by a freak accident. In truth, it had been planned, not to steal, but to feed. Bread was handed out to the starving by a hooded figure with a familiar presence. People did not see her face, but they remembered her posture, the way she moved like someone born to be obeyed. And whispers followed her like wind. One evening, Kale left his post outside Isabel's chambers to fetch water. When he returned, she was gone. Panic surged through him. He ran down every corridor, alerted the guards, raised alarms. She reappeared an hour later, unharmed. Composed brushing dust from her sleeves. When Kale demanded where she had gone, she only smiled and said, "I was exactly where I needed to be." He didn't report it. He never did again. What Kale didn't know, what no one knew, was that Isabel had discovered the existence of the Vault of Names. It was a secret registry hidden deep beneath the castle in the oldest wing built before her grandfather's time. Inside it were records of every noble birth, every land grant, every debt sworn in ink and blood. The council had kept it buried, a weapon of quiet control. With the help of Eleanor and 2 loyal scribes, Isabel gained access. For weeks, she studied the names by candlelight, cross-referencing birth lines, claims to land historical loyalties. And there, tucked into the margins of a forgotten entry, she found it. The royal decree of betrothal between her mother and a southern noble, nullified by war, but never erased. And the heir of that noble family still lived. A man named Kalen. A ghost. A myth, but a claim. A legitimate link to a powerful house that had gone underground after the conquest. He had once been thought executed. He was not. He was hiding in the deep hollow. Darian found him. That was the moment the storm truly began to form. Yes, Darian had vanished, but not into exile. He had fled to the one place the council would never look, the ruins beyond the border, where old allies of Lysmere had scattered like embers in the wind. There he began to rebuild not just himself, but a purpose. And when he heard that Isabel still lived, still fought, he returned. Not to reclaim power, but to fulfill a promise. They met again in the old forge just past midnight. No words at first, just a long, steady look. He had changed, thinner, more weathered eyes, darker, but his silence had not hardened. It had deepened, aged into something strong and still. "You came back," she said. He nodded. "I didn't think you would," she whispered. "I didn't think I could stay away," he replied. That night, they laid the foundation for what would come next. Together. Kalen was summoned in secret, and when he arrived, limping from an old wound and carrying years of bitterness, he knelt before Isabel and said, "The true line of Lysmere lives." She placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then rise and help me bring it back." They formed a pact not of blood, but of purpose. Isabel would remain the symbol, Kaelin the claim, Darian the sword. Together, they would take back what had been stolen, not with a single strike, but with 100 precise incisions. The council knew none of this. They were too busy eating themselves from the inside. Paranoia had taken root. Each member suspected the others of betrayal. The High Treasurer was found dead, drowned in a vat of ink. A messenger vanished en route to Verdant. A scribe confessed under torture that he had seen Isabel speaking with a masked stranger, then died of sudden illness before he could say more. Desperation is the final stage of tyranny. And it was then that Isabel made her boldest move yet. She called for a public address, a tradition once sacred in Lysmere, long abolished. But she used an old law still valid that allowed a royal consort to speak during the midwinter flame. The council tried to block it. She outmaneuvered them legally. In the end, they couldn't stop her. To deny the request would be to admit fear. And fear, when exposed, spreads faster than fire. On the night of the midwinter flame, the castle courtyard filled for the first time in years. Citizens gathered beneath the torchlit balconies. Snow drifted lightly in the air. The council stood behind Isabel, stiff and pale. And then she stepped forward. No crown on her head, no jewels, just a dark cloak lined in phoenix blue. She raised her hand, and the crowd fell silent. "My name is Isabel. You know me." A murmur moved through the crowd. Recognition, awe, grief. "I have lived behind walls. I have worn chains that were called jewels. I have smiled when I wanted to scream. But I have never stopped watching, never stopped remembering, never stopped hoping." The torches flickered. They told you Lysmere was dead. But here I stand. A pause. And I am not alone. And from the shadows stepped Darian, then Kaelin, then dozens more hooded figures who pulled back their cloaks to reveal the medallions of the Phoenix. Blacksmiths, scholars, soldiers, children of the fallen. The crowd erupted not in cheers, but in gasps, in breathless, trembling silence. And then someone no one could say who began to hum the old anthem. The crowd joined. And for the first time in 12 years, the song of Lysmere filled the night. Above it all, the council stood frozen, trapped in their own palace, watching a kingdom slip from their fingers. And Isabel. She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply stood there, steady as stone, while history changed around her. The midwinter flame did not end with music. It ended in silence, sharp, expectant, electric. As Isabel stepped back from the balcony, her words still hanging in the cold air, like breath made visible, she turned her back on the council without asking permission. She didn't wait to be dismissed. She no longer had to. They did not speak to her that night, but they didn't sleep either. The next morning, the city awoke to barricades. The council claimed it was a security measure. In truth, it was panic turned policy. Loyalist guards were doubled. Watchtowers were armed. Interrogations began again, this time with more cruelty than caution. One by one, Isabel's allies began to vanish. Rurik the old blacksmith was found with his forge burned and his lungs full of soot. His body bore no wounds, but his hands had been shattered. A tavern owner known for slipping messages to Isabel's scribes was dragged from his home at dawn and made to kneel in the square. They left his body there for 3 days as a warning. But fear, when used too late, stops being fear. It becomes fuel. In response, the medallions of the Phoenix stopped being secret. They began to appear in windows, carved into doors, sewn onto collars. What had started as whispers became banners. The rebellion was no longer underground, it was at the gates. The council ordered Isabel arrested. That was their second to last mistake. Cale, the young guard, who once trailed her like a hound, refused the order. They killed him in the barracks before sunrise. Word of his death spread faster than the lie they tried to cover it with. And by sundown, the first arrow was loosed. It struck the banner of Verdanth that flew above the southern wall, piercing the crest, splitting the sword and crown in half. It was a symbol, nothing more. But symbols, like queens, carry power. And on the night of the broken flame, Lysmere began to fight back. It started not with an army, but with hundreds of footsteps. Unarmed citizens gathered in the square lighting torches, singing the old anthem. Soldiers were sent to disperse them. Most stood down. Others joined the crowd. When the council sent archers, the front line of the people didn't flinch. That was when Darien returned to the castle, not through the gate, but through the tunnels he'd helped map years before. With him came Calen and a company of cloaked figures, all marked with phoenix steel. They moved like ghosts through the lower halls, disabling guards, locking doors, cutting communications. They didn't storm the throne room. They took the archives. The council's greatest weapon had never been its armies. It had been its control of the narrative. The scrolls, the names, the history rewritten to suit the victors. Isabel had always known this, which is why her first order was not to kill, but to reveal. In the center of the Grand Library, they laid out the scrolls for the people to see, documents proving betrayals, forged alliances, stolen lands, testimonies from servants who had witnessed executions disguised as accidents, orders signed by Merrin himself, approving the death of Isabel's mother long after the war had ended. Truth made visible. People flooded the halls. They didn't riot. They remembered. And remembrance, when combined with fury, is an unstoppable force. The council panicked. One fled in disguise and was caught in the market square, trampled by a crowd that didn't even know who he was. Another slit his own throat in the wine cellar, afraid of what the morning might bring. By nightfall, only 3 remained in the high tower: Chancellor Vane Lord Andros and Lady Selwyn. They barred the doors. They summoned their personal guards and waited. But Isabel didn't come with fire. She came with choice. At dawn, she sent a messenger, a girl no older than 10, wearing the blue sash of the old Lysmerian court. Her message was simple: step down or stand trial. The people will choose the sentence. The council never responded. And so Isabel came herself. She walked through the shattered gates of the high tower unarmed, flanked only by Darien and Calen. Behind them marched no army, just citizens. Bakers, teachers, blacksmiths, orphans, the forgotten. The guards at the entrance dropped their weapons. Inside the tower, Vane was waiting. His robes, disheveled eyes, bloodshot voice, hoarse from hours of arguing with ghosts. "You think you've won," he spat. "You think putting on a show of virtue makes you a queen." Isabel didn't answer at first. She stepped into the throne room, once her father's, now empty, save for cracked marble and dust. "I'm not your queen," she said, voice calm. "I'm your reckoning." He reached for his sword. Darien stepped forward, but Isabel held up her hand. She walked to the throne, touched its armrest, and then turned away. "I have no interest in sitting where my mother bled," she said quietly. "You wanted a puppet. What you created was a mirror. You wanted obedience. What you raised was your consequence." Vane lunged. It was over in seconds. Calen pinned him to the floor. Darien disarmed him. He was dragged to the steps of the tower and made to kneel before the people. They didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They simply waited. And Isabel asked a question, clear and simple. What is justice when silence ruled for too long? The people did not cry for blood. They asked for exile. So she gave it. Vain Andros and Selwyn were sent on foot to the northern pass, stripped of name and title. Their faces were not seen again. And when the dust settled, and the banners of Verdant were torn down from every wall, Isabel stood in the square once more. The people chanted her name, begged her to reclaim the throne, to crown herself. But she did not. Instead, she called for an assembly, a council chosen by the people with voices from every quarter of Lysmere. And when asked why she refused the crown, she said this: "A crown is just another prison if no one else has a voice." They called her queen anyway. But this time, the word meant something different. She did not rule from above. She led from among. And in the stillness of that first quiet night, after the rebellion had ended not in fire, but in memory, Isabel walked alone through the ruins of the old chapel, where she had once been forced to marry her jailer, where her life had been rewritten against her will. Now in its center, a single flame burned in the brazier rekindled, and beside it stood Darian. She joined him without a word, and for the first time in a very long time, she closed her eyes, not in fear, but in peace. The snow melted slowly that spring, as if the kingdom itself were unsure how to thaw after so many years buried in frost. The fires of rebellion had not left ash and ruin as most expected. Instead, they had revealed something unexpected beneath the surface roots. Old, twisted, but alive. Lysmere had survived. Not whole, not pure, but breathing. And Isabel, the girl who had once stood at a window with frostbitten fingers and a blank stare, was now the most powerful voice in a land that had tried to forget her. But she did not sit on the throne. The people built one for her anyway, not in marble or gold, but carved from wood taken from the forests of her childhood. They placed it at the center of the great hall, not raised above the others, but level. She called it the People's Chair. She only sat in it when she listened, never when she spoke. She did not wear a crown. The old one was found buried in a well, dented and rusted. When brought to her, she told the messenger to throw it back in. "I've already worn chains that shine," she said softly. "I won't wear another." Instead, she wore a pin over her heart, the phoenix medallion forged by Rurik remade. After the war, its edges smoother, now its color darker. It had once been a symbol of rebellion. Now it was a promise that even in victory, she would not forget the cost. And the cost was heavy. Freedom, Isabel discovered, was a blade with two edges. People had expected a revolution to cleanse, to purify, to remake the world. But history doesn't clean. It stains. The day after the council fell, neighboring provinces began sending emissaries, some in peace, some in panic. Trade routes had fractured. Alliances had shifted. The economy, long tailored to Verdant's demands, was in freefall. The mines had been emptied. The grain stores were guarded by private militia. Half the royal fleet had defected to pirates years earlier. Lysmere, reborn, was still bleeding. And everyone turned to her. The People's Assembly, though newly formed, looked to Isabel not just for guidance, but for leadership. They voted on laws, yes, but often asked her how to vote. They met weekly, but left decisions in her hands when they couldn't agree. What had been a symbolic figure became quietly something more. Darian saw it happening first. "You're ruling," he said one night as they sat beside the chapel brazier. "I'm guiding," she answered. He shook his head. "Guiding from the front is still leading." She didn't reply. He wasn't wrong. Each day brought new burdens. Peasant uprisings from provinces who thought the revolution meant land redistribution. Arguments between noble houses reasserting old titles. Refugees from Verdant who feared backlash, now begging for shelter. Former loyalist soldiers who wanted amnesty. Children who had lost parents on both sides now growing up in the shadow of a queen who had no court. And through it all, Isabel listened. She sat through meetings that stretched for hours, read letters late into the night, memorized names of towns, of farmers, of fathers and sons lost in the revolt. She tried to hold every piece of the broken kingdom in her hands, and over time, her fingers began to tremble. But she never asked for rest, not until Darien collapsed. It was a spring morning when they found him unconscious in the western corridor, his breath shallow, his skin pale. A wound he'd taken months before during a skirmish no one remembered had festered in silence. He had never told anyone, not even her. When Isabel sat by his bed that night, she did not cry. She only held his hand and whispered, "If you leave me now, I will burn the whole world down." He smiled, even half dead. "You already did." He survived. Barely. And when he could walk again, she forbade him from ever lifting a sword in her name. "You've done enough," she said. He wanted to protest, but he didn't. Instead, he moved into her private chambers, not as a guard, but as something else still undefined, still quiet. They never married. They never needed to. What existed between them had long since passed beyond vows. It was not romantic in the way minstrels sang about, not heroic in the way statues were carved. It was something forged in fire, then cooled in the silence of 1,000 unspoken choices. He became her shadow again, but this time by choice. And still, peace did not come, because the ghost of Verdant had not been fully exorcised. From across the border, a new king had risen, young, eager, brutal. He sent letters dripping with threats masked as diplomacy. He demanded the return of lands taken during the revolt. He requested Isabel's presence at his coronation, claiming it would ease tensions. She burned the invitation. But she didn't ignore the threat. The borders were strengthened. Spies were caught and interrogated. Former council loyalists, long silent, began to emerge from hiding. One even attempted to poison the city's well. Isabel had him executed publicly. It was the first time she'd ordered a death with her own voice. That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the fire and stared into the flames, remembering all the times she'd dreamed of justice. All the times she'd imagined what it would feel like. It did not feel like victory. It felt like weight. And yet, she carried it. Because someone had to. She visited orphanages rebuilt from old barracks. She walked the farmlands herself, speaking with workers who still bore scars from the war. She held the hands of widows, ate with the poor, sat with grieving mothers who had once cursed her name and now wept in her arms. And one day, standing at the cliff where her father had once spoken to the kingdom, she made a decision. She would step down, not in shame, not in weakness, but in fulfillment. She called the assembly to session and announced her resignation, not as leader, but as symbol. "The phoenix is not a throne," she said. "It is a signal fire, and fire is not meant to be kept." There were protests, pleas, outrage. She did not waver. In her place, she nominated a council of 7 diverse, voted in by province and profession. She gave them no titles, only responsibility. She remained as advisor, and after that day, she never spoke publicly again. Years passed. Darien built a home for them in the hills north of the capital, a simple stone cottage with an olive tree planted out front. Eleanor lived nearby, growing herbs and brewing teas. Caelan became a general in the new Lysmerian Guard. He never married. He never stopped protecting her. And Isabel, she wrote. Volumes. Not memoirs. Not propaganda. But stories. Of kingdoms and orphans. Of choices and silence. Of symbols. Of girls who outlived their cages. She never published them. But the people who read them said the voice on the page was softer than a queen's, but heavier than a crown. One winter, Darian grew ill again. This time, there was no healing. He died beside her, holding her hand, just as he had lived quiet, constant, loyal. She buried him beneath the olive tree. No monument, no inscription, only the phoenix pin left on the stone above his grave. And when she died, many years later, no one found her in a palace. She passed in her sleep in the same cottage, surrounded by letters she'd never sent, and dreams she'd never spoken aloud. The people built her a memorial, but no statue stood upon it, only a stone carved with words. She was never crowned, but we followed her anyway, and below it, smaller Isabel of Lysmere, the child queen who chose not to rule, and saved us all. Long after Isabel's death, long after the fires of rebellion had faded into the soft gray ashes of memory, people still spoke her name, but never loudly. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Like one whispers a prayer or a name you're afraid might vanish if spoken too quickly. Time passed. The cottage where she had lived and died was preserved, though no one ever moved into it again. Not by decree, not by law, but by some silent understanding. The olive tree continued to grow tall and crooked, bending slightly to the east, as if bowing to something it alone could see. Beneath its roots lay two graves, one marked by a smooth stone, bearing no name, the other smaller, shaped like a book with no title. Travelers came from faraway kingdoms to visit the site. They expected a monument, a statue, a shrine of gold. Instead, they found silence wind and the faint scent of time from the nearby garden, and many of them, especially the ones who came alone, knelt down and cried without knowing exactly why. Some said they could still feel her presence there, not as a ghost, but as a question. Who was Isabel really? A child queen, a fallen princess, a rebel who refused to be ruled, a symbol that refused to shatter, or was she simply a girl who endured? The scholars wrote their histories, of course. They debated in academies, in towers, made of glass and pride. They argued about the timeline of the rebellion, whether she ever truly relinquished power, whether she had orchestrated everything from the start like a masterful tactician. Some said she was a genius. Others said she was lucky. Still, others claimed she had no plan at all, that she had merely survived longer than anyone expected her to. But the people, those who had lived under her silence, her presence, her weight, they remembered something different. They remembered the quiet way she walked through the city after the council fell, offering no victory speech. They remembered the way she listened to farmers more carefully than she listened to generals. They remembered the way she looked at the sky, like she was always listening to something just out of reach. And most of all, they remembered how she stepped down, not with a cry of triumph, but with a whisper that changed the entire kingdom. Fire is not meant to be kept. In the decades that followed, the Republic of Lysmere flourished, slowly, imperfectly, but more freely than before. The People's Assembly grew stronger. The Phoenix medallions, once forged in secret, were now displayed in classrooms and council halls as a reminder that power once taken must be held with trembling hands. New leaders came and went, some better than others, some who tried to claim her legacy, others who tried to erase it. But none could escape her shadow, not because she loomed large, but because she chose not to. And that choice haunted them. Isabel's writings were found years later in a trunk beneath the floorboards of the cottage. Dozens of notebooks, each carefully labeled with no author's name. The ink had faded in places, the edges chewed by time and moths. They were not memoirs. They were not declarations. They were questions. One notebook was simply titled, "How do you keep your soul while holding a sword?" Another, "What does it mean to win? and one small page scrawled in a different hand. Darian's perhaps held a line that was underlined twice. You can kill a tyrant, but what do you do with the silence that follows? That silence, the silence after the crown, was what defined her. Isabel had spent her early life being spoken for, told where to sit, how to smile, when to obey. Even when she became queen in name, her voice was considered ornamental, but her rebellion had not been loud. It had been careful, precise, built on listening, not shouting. And in the end, she taught an entire kingdom how to hear itself again, not by issuing commands, but by stepping away. Her decision to relinquish power was more radical than any battle she had ever fought, because it said quietly but clearly, I trust you now. And that trust rippled through generations. The children of Lysmere grew up hearing bedtime stories, not about dragons or witches, but about the girl in the tower who learned how to wait. They drew pictures of phoenixes, yes, but not soaring, nesting. And in the rarest cases, they read her actual words. It is not power that corrupts, it is fear. And it is not crowns that bind us, it is forgetting how heavy they are. Some kingdoms feared Lysmere's legacy. Verdansk never fully recovered, and its rulers, less bold than Isabel, more brittle than vain, tried to erase her from their records. But even there, her story slipped through cracks in the walls. A merchant in the Verdansk capital once carved her name into the underside of his cart. A schoolteacher in a distant province renamed her daughter Isa. A musician rewrote the band anthem disguised as a love song. Because Isabel's story was not Lysmere's alone. It was every story, of every girl told to sit down, of every voice trained to whisper, of every crown that tried to press the spirit flat. And somewhere even now, as the world turns quietly into night, there are those who lie in bed, staring at ceilings, wondering who they would be if they'd had her patience, her clarity, her fire that never demanded to be seen. It wasn't greatness she chased, it was truth. And the truth was, this she had been a queen without a throne, a prisoner without chains, a soldier without a sword. She had been forced to marry her executioner, and she had chosen to love him anyway. Not for what he had done, but for what he had refused to do, kill the last part of her that still dreamed. Darian's legacy lived on too, but never in the same way. His name was etched into no scrolls. No songs were sung in his honor. But whenever someone refused to follow an unjust order, whenever someone chose conscience over command, they were said to be walking in Darian's boots. And perhaps that was enough. In the end, history did not give Isabel the throne she was born to, but it gave her something far more rare. It gave her the final word. And the final word was not revenge. It was not power. It was not even justice. It was this, let them choose their future. I have already lived mine. And with that, her story was complete. Not perfect, but true. Just like her. Long after the last book closed on Isabel's life, after the world had moved on to newer wars, louder queens, and brighter flames, there remained a certain quiet. A shadow stitched into the fabric of the world that refused to be forgotten. Not because it demanded to be remembered, but because forgetting it felt disrespectful. Isabel of Lysmere did not die a ruler. She did not become a saint. No temples bore her name. No holidays celebrated her victories. But still, her presence lingered. Subtle, honest, steady. Like a low note in a song no one can hum, but everyone feels. In the years following her passing, the world changed more than she ever saw. Machines replaced messengers. Maps grew and bent and rewrote themselves. Borders bled, redrew, collapsed. New empires rose on old bones. Ideologies shifted like sand. Language turned on itself. Progress marched forward with the sound of thunder and engines. But somehow, in the smallest places, she remained. A poem in a diary, a symbol scratched into the bottom of a school desk, a lullaby with no name sung to a child with a trembling voice. The tower stood, the flame was dim, but she still knew her name. Somewhere in a quiet town, nestled in the mountains, there is a tiny public square, paved in worn stone. At its center, there is no statue, no plaque, only a bench, plain unpainted. Beside it grows a tree, not the olive tree from Isabel's grave, but a seed taken from its roots. Locals call it the listening tree. Old women sit beneath it in the summer and tell stories to children. Not always about Isabel. Sometimes just about waiting, about patience, about choosing gentleness in a world obsessed with fury. They don't mention crowns, because the point was never the crown. The point was the silence after it. You see, there's something most stories don't tell you. They tell you about the fall, about the fire, about the rebellion, the sword, the speech that changed the world. But they rarely tell you what happens after the echoes fade, after the crowd disperses, after the banners are folded and put away. What happens when the throne is empty and stays that way? That's the part Isabel understood better than anyone, because she had lived it before the story even began. In truth, her story didn't start with the wedding, or the war, or the tower. It started with silence, a silence that stretched from childhood, across fear, across loss, until it wasn't just something she endured. It became something she chose. There's something radical in that. To speak when you are told to be silent is one kind of courage, but to stay silent when the world expects you to roar, that is another. Not weakness, but wisdom. That's what made her different from the tyrants and the martyrs and the monarchs who came before. She never asked to be believed. She asked to be understood. She didn't conquer her enemies. She outlasted them. She didn't fight to wear the crown. She fought to discard it and still matter. And maybe that's the most impossible magic of all. There are children now, centuries removed from her life, who dream of her face without ever having seen a portrait, who whisper stories of a girl in a tower and feel braver in the dark because of her, who look at power and remember that sometimes walking away from it is the most powerful thing you can do. And in that way, she never left. Her words still float in the margins of old pages. You do not have to be loud to change the world. Let them keep their thrones. I'll keep my soul. Ask the question no one wants to answer, then sit quietly until they do. She left behind no crown, no heirs, no dynasty. But she left behind a story. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes a story is enough. It passes from tongue to ear, from pen to page, from silence to breath, without permission, without structure, without fanfare, and still, it lingers. That's why even now there are those who sit by candlelight, or beneath starlight, or in a quiet room where no one is watching, and whisper her name like a secret too sacred to speak aloud. Not to pray, not to plead, but to remember. To remember the child who was forced to marry her executioner, who lost everything and chose not to become what she hated, who turned a prison into a place of patience, who saw a sword raised over her head and whispered, "Not yet," who was forgotten by kings but never by her people. And in that remembering, she lives, no longer in rebellion, but in rhythm, in pause, in the hush before a hard truth, in the breath someone takes before deciding to speak, or not to, in the space between power and peace. That is where Isabel waits, not as a ghost, but as a guide. And if you listen, really listen in the stillest part of the night, you might hear her. Not with your ears, but with something deeper, That quiet, fierce part of you that still believes in right over rule, in choice over command, in being over being obeyed. And then just maybe, you'll close your eyes and feel less alone, because she was here, and she stayed, not in body, but in you. Centuries pass differently when your name becomes story. Time does not forget you. Outright it folds you, softly, neatly, tucking you into the quiet corners of songs and the curled spines of books that no one reads in daylight. You're not erased, just misremembered. That's what happened to Isabel. As the generations turned and the world spun faster with its steam and steel and hum of electric empires, her memory shifted shape. She was still told in lullabies and whispers, but her name lost the sharpness of syllables. Her deeds became outlines, her fire metaphor, her silence romantic. And yet, even distorted, she remained. Because there's something impossible to kill about a woman who never asked to be remembered, especially one who ruled by stepping back, especially one who never crowned herself and so could never be dethroned. In the new Lysmere now, a nation known more for commerce than courage, students still studied the old revolution. They analyzed the strategies, debated the timelines. Some professors called Isabel the accidental architect of democracy. Others called her a fiction born of national guilt. Some said she never existed at all, just a figure made from the collective longing of a people starved for justice. But every few years, a student usually quiet, usually unnoticed, would find themselves standing before her grave under the listening tree, and something in their chest would still. Not out of awe, but out of recognition, as if something deep in their bones said, "Ah." So this is where the silence lives. That silence, it wasn't empty. It never had been. It was full, overflowing, with everything she chose not to say, with everything she carried alone. The books she wrote were studied now in hushed lectures and candle-lit discussion circles. But even the most brilliant minds couldn't agree on their meaning. Some thought they were parables. Others read them as political philosophy. One professor famously claimed the stories were nothing more than veiled trauma diaries. But a small group, those who read her words not for answers, but for questions, began calling themselves the Order of the Whispered Flame. They were scholars, artists, midwives, translators, caretakers, healers, people who didn't seek thrones but spaces between them, people who didn't want to command but to connect. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't make noise. They simply listened. In times of turmoil, when the world spun too fast, when tyrants rose in new clothes, when old lies returned with new teeth, the order would gather. Never in the same place, never with the same names, and always, always in silence. They would read from her pages, not aloud, but side by side. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they said nothing for hours. And when the dawn came, they returned to the world not with swords, but with stillness. That was Isabel's legacy. Not revolution, but reverberation. The slow, persistent echo of what happens when one person refuses to become what hurt them. The ripple of a life lived not in defiance, but in definition. Isabel did not change the world overnight. She changed the way people believed they could change the world. And that was far more dangerous, because true belief, does not need banners or armies. It only needs witnesses. And witnesses are everywhere. A boy who stops himself from raising his voice and chooses to listen instead. A woman in a boardroom who asks, "What do you need?" before saying what she wants. A leader who steps down before they are asked to. A teacher who tells their students, "You don't need to be powerful. Just present." A child who hears the old song and hums it without knowing why, just that it feels safe. These are the children of Isabel. Not by blood, but by becoming. Because that's the quiet miracle of her story, it didn't end. It transferred, like fire passed from candle to candle, like memory passed in dreams, like silence passed in a look between two people who understand the weight of things left unsaid. There were no statues built in her image, but every time a person chose not to dominate, she lived. Every time someone took the long path instead of the easy win, she breathed. Every time power was offered and gently refused, she smiled. Somewhere her name still flickers across old stone, sometimes misspelled, sometimes misremembered, but always returned to. Because you cannot bury a woman who turned silence into sanctuary. You cannot erase someone who erased nothing. You cannot kill the memory of the one who survived by being still. And maybe, just maybe, that's what we need now more than ever. Not louder voices, not stronger fists, but wiser quiet. The kind that listens first, the kind that watches carefully, the kind that stands in the center of history and doesn't demand to be seen, but offers space for others to speak. So when you feel tired of the noise of the endless rise and fall of crowned names and shouted victories, remember her. Sit by a window, breathe, and listen. She's there, in the hush before the dawn, in the warmth between two hands that have stopped fighting, in the pages of a forgotten book, in the dust of a room no longer guarded, in you. Because Isabel of Lysmere was not just a queen. She was the answer to a question we are still too afraid to ask. If I gave up the power to rule others, would I still be enough? She answered yes, and then she proved it, without force, without glory, without noise. And that in the end is why her story was never truly hers. It is ours now, to carry, to protect, to whisper, and to live. It is a strange thing how some stories end not with a door closing, but with a window opening. Not with applause, but with breath. Not with a final word, but a final stillness. And so we come to the end, but not of Isabel. Because Isabel was never meant to have an ending. She was written not as a monument, but as motion, as memory, as a rhythm too steady to die. Even now you can feel her not in the pages of history, but in the pauses of your own life. That moment just before you speak. That decision to listen instead of command. That ache in your chest when someone misunderstands what you've chosen not to explain. She is there, not haunting, but holding. Like a weightless presence in the corner of your room. Like light that never touches the floor, but fills the space, regardless. In the years after her story faded from scrolls and syllabi, her name took root elsewhere, not in halls of power, but in the quiet places. Her words began appearing in languages she never spoke, translated not for accuracy, but for feeling. Her silence was passed down like a melody, hummed not sung. And still, questions lingered. Why didn't she take the crown? Why didn't she name an heir? Why didn't she fight louder, hold longer, burn brighter? The questions reveal the world's assumptions that power is only real when it dominates, that victory is only meaningful when it's visible, that legacy must be measured in monuments. But Isabel measured nothing. She simply was. And in that being, in that choice, not to conquer, but to care, not to rule, but to remain, she rewrote what it meant to be remembered. She lived in full, without pageantry, without armor, without certainty. And somehow that was enough. There's an old myth that says the greatest leaders are forgotten because the world they leave behind no longer needs them. It's not true, of course, but it's beautiful And beauty Isabel taught us is its own kind of truth. In the town where she once walked barefoot to the market, not as a queen, but as a neighbor, a child once asked their grandmother who Isabel was. The old woman smiled and said, "She was the one who taught us how to listen." That was it. No bloodline, no war, no throne, just listening. And in that quiet response was all the power the world had ever needed. Even now, if you walk far enough through the hills of the old country, past the rusted gates and fallen mile markers, you might find the cottage still standing. The olive tree has grown wild, its branches heavy with silence. No path leads there anymore, only instinct. Inside the walls are bare. The hearth is cold. But if you sit long enough in the dust and hush, you'll begin to hear it. A voice without sound, a presence without form, a life still echoing. And you'll realize something you've always known, that the story was never about Isabel winning. It was about what she refused to lose. Her soul, her softness, her silence. They tried to take everything: her name, her title, her future. And at one point, they nearly succeeded. But they could never take what she wouldn't offer. And what she didn't offer was herself. Not to their image, not to their narrative, not to their cruelty. She stayed her own. A girl, a queen, a question, and maybe an answer. Because in the end, we're not really drawn to Isabel because of what she did. We're drawn to her because of what she chose not to do. We love her not for her triumphs, but for her restraint. In a world obsessed with reaction, she responded with stillness. In a world built on spectacle, she gave us subtlety. In a world that prizes noise, she gave us peace. And peace is harder to hold than any sword, harder to keep than any crown, harder to live in than any tower. But she did. And when she left quietly, without ceremony, without title, she left behind a legacy that couldn't be measured in years, but in echoes. So tonight, as you drift closer to sleep, let this story settle around you. Let it wrap around your breath like the dusk that once wrapped the hills of Lysmere. Let it guide your thoughts not to endings, but to openings. And if in the darkness you feel uncertain, if the world outside your window feels too loud, too sharp, too fast, remember her. Not the queen, not the rebel, not the legend. Just the girl in the tower who waited, who listened, who chose not to rise, but to remain, and who, in remaining, became endless. Thank you for walking with her, for following this story through its silence and its stillness, for remembering what history often forgets: that the brightest flame is not the one that burns everything down. It's the one that never asks to be seen. Good night, and may your dreams carry her gently home.